Okay.
Okay, today's daf is daf ches, and we'll start from the top of the Amud. Amar Rabbi Zera Amar Shmuel, libein. The word libein means to heat it up until it gets white. It's really, really hot. So it comes from the shorish of the word lavan. Libein sakin, for some reason, which is beyond my comprehension, the shochet decided to heat up the knife of the sakin before he shechted it v'shachad pa. So Shmuel says, Shchitaso kshera. Now let's understand. There are two ways of destroying the two simonim, the esophagus and the windpipe. One is through chidud, which means the sharp, razor sharp blade of the knife, and the other is through sreifa, by burning it. Now here, two things are happening, presumably simultaneously, because the absolute high heat of the knife is going to burn up the two simonim. That's not shchita. On the other hand, the blade of the knife is cutting into the two simonim. So Shmuel says we're going to vote in favor of the chidud, which means the razor sharp knife, because chiduda kodem lilibuna, meaning the first contact between the knife and the simonim, the esophagus and the windpipe, is through the knife itself, the sharpness, the razor sharpness of the knife. It's going to take a few seconds until those two organs, the two simonim, will touch the outside of the knife, both sides of the knife, which are burning hot, and then get burnt. So that's okay, because once the shechita was kosher, it was valid, immediately with the cutting of the two simonim, what happens later if the animal gets burnt, that's irrelevant, and therefore kshera. So the Gemara says, well, ikot stadim, but wait a second, you're right that maybe the chidud comes before the libun, but immediately and simultaneously with the chituch, with the cutting, there's contact between the sides of the knife and the two simonim. And that happens simultaneously. So the two simonim are burnt up as you're doing the chituch, the cutting, the chidud. And the Gemara answers base hashchita mirvas ravach. Now, what we're about to see over and over again through today's daf is what I call a mitzius, a reality. And it's a little bit difficult to picture the reality, but what the Gemara is saying is that, again, there's a two-stage process. What happens is that with this chidud, with this, blade cutting into the simonim, the parts of the simonim that were cut spread, and as a result, there's no contact, or shall we say no immediate contact for sure, between the sides of the knife and the simonim. Because immediately, even before you can breathe, you already have a split, and that split is a result of the chidud. So even if at some point, the sides of the knife, come in contact with the opening of the two simonim, the shechita is already done. Now, what we're about to embark upon now, and I have to admit that, late at night when I learn these kind of sugyas, I inevitably fall asleep because they are so complicated. We're about to learn the laws of negat tzaras, which is called nigei haguf. There are other types of negoim, but we're talking about nigei haguf. And when there's a breakout of a nega, the Kohen is called in to take a look and see if it's suspect and give it what's called hezger, which means that we, so to speak, lock it up for a week. The Kohen's going to come back a week later, and he's going to see what happens to the nega. If it's healed, that's fine, and therefore there's no ruling on the part of the Kohen, no announcement that this is tsaras and he's mitzora. But if, on the other hand, what might happen is one of two things. Either the nega itself starts spreading, and that's a simon that it's real tsaras, or if that doesn't happen, if white hairs very unusually grow out of this afflicted area, then that also is proof positive that he's a mitzora. Having said that, we go on to introduction Roman numeral number 2, and that is there's something called shchin, and there's something called michvah. Now, michvah is a burn, and shchin is as a result of an injury, you have inflammation. And both are simone tsaras, simone negoim. But it's very critical to classify it as either a burn or an inflammation, even though both will generate tumas tsaras, but you have to classify them. If you don't classify them and define them, you're going to be in trouble in a case of what's called chatzi ki gris. A gris, which is a certain, like, supposedly it's the size of an American dime, a very small parameter, but a gris is the shear, the minimum size of a nega that could qualify as tsaras. If, let's say, you have half a gris of shchin, another half of gris of michvah, we cannot integrate them to form one whole. So now it's critical to classify and identify, do we have here michvah or do we have shchin? And in a case where someone gets a bang from something that's burning hot, we're going to have to determine what came first, the inflammation or the burn. And believe it or not, whatever came first loses out to what comes second. So we're talking about a situation where there's a sequence of either shchin first and then michvah, or the opposite, michvah first and then shchin. And in this process, the last one, the second one in sequence, is the one that determines. So we're going to learn now a little bit about tsaras, and then we're going to swing back to Shmuel's statement about cutting the two simonim in shchita of a hot, burning, white-hot knife, shchita knife. Iboilahu. Libein shapud, right? So we're not talking about now shchita, so we're not talking about a knife, we're talking about a shpud. Shpud is usually translated as a spit, meaning it's a long, like a longer extended piece of metal. And he puts it on the fire until it becomes white hot. And then hikabo. So again, first of all, we have to lock him up, but that's not our issue today. Our issue today is, as a result of the hakah, the victim developed tsaras. And now we have to determine and classify what was the nature of the nega that developed as a result of this hakah. Mishum shchin nidon or mishum michvah nidon? Do we classify it as shchin or as a burn, which is called a michvah? L'may nafkemina. So now the Gemara is going to give that whole explanation that I introduced. L'kidasanya, we learned in the Brisa. Shchin u'michvah metamin b'shavua echad. Meaning, if after a week there still is shchin u'michvah, it didn't disappear, it didn't heal, then we have cause for determining, for the Kohen to announce that this is a negatzoras. Now, Bishnei Simonim, if the situation doesn't improve, then we have a negatzoras, which after the first week, if one of two simonim appear, then the Kohen will declare this is a mitzorah. He is a mitzorah. The first simon is called seir lavan. Some unusual white hair just grows out of this injury. And the second one is pisyon. Pisyon is another way of saying that the nega expanded. So what's the significance here? If you're telling me that whether or not it's a mikvah or it's shchin, in either case, we have to wait for one of these two simonim that will determine and clinch his status as a mitzorah. So why are you interested in knowing whether it's a shchin or a mikvah? In both cases, it all depends upon when the Kohen comes back at the end of the week and he looks and he scrutinizes to try to determine whether or not one of these two simonim appear. Who cares whether it was mikvah or it was shchin. So the Gemara answers, the Brisa answers, lo mar she'ein mitztarfim zeh zeh. So let's say, for example, he had two negoyim in close proximity. One of them is definitely shchin, but it only has a half a gris. That's not enough for the shear. The other one, if it is shchin, because we've identified as shchin, then even though it only has a half a gris, we can be mitzarefed to and declare that he's tameh. But if the other one is going to be identified as mikvah, then mikvah and shchin do not integrate to form tumas tzaras. Utnan, let's go on with a Mishnah in Negoim. Ezu shchin v'ezu mikvah. And again, there's a long brisa here, but in the middle, it's very confusing because in the middle, the brisa sort of like takes a little digression. So it works like this. Laka be'etz be'even be'gefes be'chamitveria. In any of the above cases, and then as a general rule, b'chol davar shelo ba machmas ha'or. So this makkah that he received was not a result of something hot, of a fire. It was either a result of getting hit by a piece of wood, by a rock, by the psoles of olives, the pits of olives, or the heated water of Chamei Tveria. But again, it's heated water, but it's not fire. Then in all these cases, it's called shchid. Why did you add bechol davar shelo ba machmas ha'or lasuye avar me'ikaro? Apparently, when they first take the stones out of the quarry, out of the mines, the stones are heated, and when you hit someone with a stone that's heated because it's straight out of the mine, then it could burn. But nevertheless, zeu shchin. The Mishnah says it's still called shchin because there was no fire. Ezu mikvah. Mikvah is a burn. Nichva begacheles. Gacheles means coals, like we had on Lag BaOmer here. Beremetz. Remetz is after you burn the wood, the ashes are still hot. Besid. And there are different kinds of sid, but sid is basically called lime in English. And we have sid roseach, and we have another kind of, besides boiling lime, we have gafsis roseach, gifsis roseach. All this, by the way, is relevant to the second parak of Shabbos, when we talk about a gruf and a ketuma. In any event, so this boiling gifsis, which is called in English gifsum, interesting how similar the word is to its Aramaic. Anyway, that's called mikvah. Now, why did you add in the Mishnah bechol davar ba machmas ha'or? The answer is lasuye chamei ha'or. So apparently, when you heat up water with fire, the water that injures someone is called mikvah, as if he was injured directly by the fire. As opposed to chametferia, where maybe there's some heat below the surface of the ground, that's not considered mikvah. Besanya, we learned to the Brisa shchinu mikvah. Oh, so now what happens if a person, as a result of a double makkah, received both, he was injured in both a shchin and a mikvah? So that's why I told you the last one determines im shchin kodem lemikvah, then batal mikvah shchin. So if the mikvah came after the shchin, then the mikvah is mevatel the shchin, and in the opposite case, if mikvah kodemes l'shchin, so now the shchin came later, is bitel shchin as mikvah. The shchin is going to nullify the status of mikvah. And again, all this is relevant to tziruf, to integrating a chatzi gris with another chatzi gris, because it can only be integrated with its like kind. And vahacha hechi dami. What was the question that we raised? The answer to which we're going to try to support from Shmuel's statement about cutting with a knife that was burning hot. Kigon dahavi be chatzi gris shchin meikara. It's already a while that he has shchin, but he only has shchin of a chatzi gris. And now, libein shpud vehikabo, as a result of the fact that he heated up this shpud and wounded him, now two things occurred. There's shchin, the inflammation, and there's mikvah, which is the burn. V'nafek be chatzi gris acher. As a result of this hakah, of this wound, we have another chatzi gris. Which is first? And which is last, so that as a result of this makkah, we could identify this nega as either or, mikvah or shchin. If chavata kadim, if it's the chavata, which is parallel in the case of a sakin shel shchita to chidud, and we're talking about the impact of the blow, so that is an inflammation that came first. And then afterwards, subsequently, if we assume nechavata kodim, osi havla, the heat of the hot shpud, mevatale lechavta, v'havile shchinu michfu. So now again, he started with a chatzi gris of shchin, and now because the burn came after the inflammation, therefore we have now shchinu michva v'lo mitztarf, and we cannot integrate them to form a full gris, and therefore he's not tummy. Oh, Dilmo, should we say the opposite? Havla kodim, first starts the burn, the immediate contact of this burning hot shpud with his body. V'osi chavata, and now the impact, which causes an inflammation, comes along with mevatel lahavla, v'havle shchinu shchin umitztarf. Toshma, the answer to this question should come through Shmuel. So we're going to endeavor onto an analogy to Shmuel. Why? Because chiduda kodim lilibuna. So we see that the libun, meaning the burn as a result of the hot knife, is going to come second. Alma chavata kodim, meaning the impact of the blow, which in this case is called chidud, which is the cutting through the sharp razor knife of the shchita knife, that came first, and then the burning came later, and therefore by process of analogy, we would have a mikvah that's mevatel the shchit. And why is the mikvah vatel shchim? Because the mikvah is last. The burning came last. So in shchita, the fact that the burning came last is lekula, because it validates the shchita. Because the simanim weren't burnt initially, they were cut. And again, the fact that the chidud precedes the michvah, or in the Gemara's language, the limud. So michvah is second, and that works in favor of validating the shechita because then the chidud came first. And in tzaras, it could either be lekula or lechumra, depending upon what the first half of gris was. So now we're establishing that the michvah came last. If the first half of gris was michvah, then it's lechumra. He's tamei. If on the other hand, the first half of gris, like the Gemara's case here, is shchin, then he's tar. Gemara says, no. Your analogy is off base. Why? Chidud shine. You know what? You can't compare a knife to a shpud. Why? Because in the case of a knife, we have something called duchka de sakina, the sharpness of the bluntness or the sharpness of the knife. And that has the immediate effect, and therefore the heat comes later. However, in a case of a shpud where a victim received a blow, it's very possible that the burning came before the injury and the impact of the blow and the inflammation. Toshma, let's bring a different proof from a brisa. Libein shapud vehikabo nido mishum michvas esh. Here, the brisa is outspoken about the fact that in the very case that we're addressing, the burning comes first. Nido mishum michvas esh. So even though there was an impact of the shpud when it hit the person, the victim, but nevertheless, for the first thing that happens to the person is the burning as a result of the hot, the super hot shipud. Gemara rejects this as well. Hosam nami de barzale mivras. Dahainu chidut. What happened over here? There are two possibilities. One possibility is the assaultant, right? He had a glove and he was holding on to this shipud, burning hot shipud, and he gave the guy a smack. The other is maybe the tippy end of the shipud, that's what went in. And the nafkamina is going to be whether it's michvah or shchin. Why? Because if he hits him from the side and gives him a smack, then the heat will burn the body. And that's called michvah. But if on the other hand he pokes him with the sharp edge of the spit of the shipud, right, the pointed tip of the shipud, then that's called chidud. And there we're going to apply the yardstick of Shmuel, as we saw in the chidud of the knife, and the chavata comes before the michvah, and therefore it's considered as michvah. Now, if the sakin was used for idol worship, which means that they slaughtered an animal for their gods, and they used this knife to slaughter the animal, and you and I would say that you're not allowed to use this knife for shechita for one of two possible reasons. One is that anything that's avodah zarah is asur b'hana, and by using this knife for shechita to be matir the basar, you are being nena, you're benefiting from a avodah zarah. And another problem that's going to arise is that obviously the idol worshiper is not implementing a kosher shechita. The animal is nevela, and the knife that the idol worshiper uses now collects the tam, the taste of the isur. And to our surprise, Rabbah says mutar lishchot ba. You're allowed to use it for shechita. And maybe the Gemara is going to say that we have to define hana. Hana means that we look at the entire picture of the event that took place, and we gauge in the final analysis whether there's a plus or a minus. And that minus is called makalkel. Now, it's very interesting. We want to do shchita so that we can eat the meat. But that's worth less on the market than the live animal, because the live animal could do disha and charisha and all the different things that you want to do with a live animal. So therefore, shchita is defined, according to halacha, as a makalkel. It actually reduces the market value of the animal. Now it's worth meat. Before it was worth a live working animal. And therefore, Rabbah says, mutal lishchot lo, it's makalkel. That doesn't qualify as hana. Hana means you have total benefit when we look at the whole picture. But also lachtelcho basor, why? Because mitakinhu, meaning that if you already did the shechita, now you want to use this sakin shel avodas kocham to cut up the meat into smaller pieces so that you could market it, meaning it's a butcher's knife, that's called metalkein, and then you're benefiting from a sakin shel avodah zarah, which is a chefza d'isur hana. Amar Rava, pa'amim shashochet asur, you know what? I could turn it inside out. I could tell you that under certain circumstances, shechita benefits the shochet in the total monetary picture. Why? The animal was on its way to die, and if it dies, the basar is worth very little. Give it to your non-Jewish neighbor, try to sell it to him for whatever he'll give you. But as a result of the shechita, the animal is kosher, and the meat can be sold on the kosher meat market. And yet, says Rava, I can switch it around even in terms of machatech basar. Not always is there a total benefit in hana from cutting meat into small pieces. Why? Bi'atme de kaima lekurva. Let's say you want to give a gift to someone, and you have this very large piece of meat. You don't want to cut it into small pieces. You want to give him the larger piece of meat. He could put it into the freezer and he could decide, and it's much more impressive. I don't know, gentlemen, I have a little interest in art. So Rembrandt and many others are famous for paintings of these gigantic pieces of meat that are hanging, in the thing, if you've ever seen it. Frekti Gemara, you've analyzed this issue of using a sakin shel avodah zarah. From the perspective of hana, are you benefiting from avodah zarah? Forget about that. Tepukle mishum shamnunis de isura. Wait a second. Shamnunis means there's a certain fatty substance that is now, the time of the meat from the avodah zarah is now embedded, so to speak, in this knife. And now, after this absorbed time will be, after the shechita, it will be polate. Polate means it'll be ejected, so to speak, spit into whatever the animal that you're shechting. So maybe you've solved one problem, and that could justify the conclusion of Rabbah that you're allowed to shecht with a sakin shel avodah zarah, but we have another problem of shamnunis, and that you haven't addressed that problem.